2, 3, go.
Hello and welcome to the PFF Q&A live show. I'm Doug Kyed, joined as always by Ari Meirov and Brad Spielberger. Guys, how are you doing today?
Well, look at this. We got a full game of games. We had a Sunday. We had an awesome amount of games. And now here we are on Monday, and it's overreaction galore all over the place, which is just my favorite part after every week one. But a reminder to everyone that we have 17 more weeks left. Everyone should relax if your team lost, and there's a lot more football left.
I think it's impossible to avoid. I tell myself every year not to overreact, and then after week one, I'm like, this is the worst team in the league. This team's winning the Super Bowl, so it's just natural, I suppose.
Yeah, Brad, I think you were a must follow last night when your Chicago Bears were probably frustrating you mightily. But speaking of 17 weeks left, make sure to subscribe to PFF using the promo code Kickoff30. Great stuff coming all season on PFF. So make sure to subscribe. That is 30% off any subscription. Also, drop any questions that you have or comments in the comment section. We will definitely try to get to those. But first off, we're going to talk about things that impressed us and things that surprised us from week one. And I'll just kick that off with what impressed me from week one. And that was some of those rookie wide receivers. I was really impressed by the Bengals, Jamar Chase, by the Dolphins, Jalen Waddle, by the Eagles, Devontae Smith. I think that all of those guys pretty much immediately lived up to their expectations from where they were drafted in the first round. Kadarius Toney, another wide receiver taken in the first round, didn't play nearly as much. Elijah Moore wasn't quite as impressive as Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, and Devontae Smith. But like I said, those guys, very impressive. They all had PFF receiving grades over 70, which was definitely a solid start for all three of those guys. All three of them had touchdowns. Jalen Waddle did have a drop, but he also forced 2 missed tackles. Jamar Chase forced 2 missed tackles. Jamar Chase went over 100 yards, didn't show off those drop issues that he had during the preseason, seemed just fine catching that slightly larger ball without the white stripes around it. Big play threat already there in Cincinnati. And just one more to add to there, Rondale Moore of the Arizona Cardinals, second round pick, but he was actually the highest graded rookie wide receiver from week one. 4 catches on 5 targets, 68 yards, didn't play as many snaps as those other guys, but also like Waddle and like Chase, forced 2 missed tackles. So definitely a good start for those rookie wide receivers there in week one. Ari, what was the biggest thing that impressed you this week?
Well, Doug, first of all, you're right. The rookie receivers, especially a few of the first round ones, were really impressive. But for me, I'm going to go with the Chargers and specifically their offensive line. But before I even get to that, first of all, that game yesterday was the type of game that they would lose every year. That's a one possession game, close game, and then you get the gut wrenching moment and they lose. That did not happen yesterday. And not only that, it looked like they escaped week one without any major injury, which is a pretty big deal for the Chargers, okay? This is a team that always has big injuries. They got through that as well yesterday, and it was a team that's coming from the West Coast to the East Coast, and it was a 1 o'clock early window game, and they looked really good. And that offensive line, it was one of the worst offensive lines last year. They addressed it in the offseason, signing Corey Linsley, signing Matt Filer, and drafting Rashawn Slater, and their first test is against this ferocious Washington defensive line. And what did they do? From all the teams who played on Sunday, their offensive line allowed the lowest pressure in the NFL, lowest pressure rate in the entire NFL, which is just unbelievable when, you speak about this Washington defensive line. We did not hear the name Chase Young at all yesterday. I mean, that's really impressive. And for them to do that against Washington, that's an early good sign. Justin Herbert looked really good besides for a bad interception in the red zone. His receivers had a couple of drops, but they'll clean that up. But overall, I was really impressed with this Chargers team. I know there's a lot of hype with this team coming into the year, and they showed me a lot yesterday.
Yeah, and right tackle Brian Bulaga was getting his back worked on the sideline for much of the game too, so he could even get healthier and improve. And in typical Charger fashion, like you mentioned, they had that, I think, one of the worst calls of the week, maybe the worst call of the weekend, when Herbert got sacked and kind of the ball got hit, and I thought it was an obvious incomplete pass. They call it a fumble touchback out of the back of the end zone, and they still managed to hang on and win. So that was great for them. My biggest takeaway, most impressive team, I'm going to raise my hand and take my licks. The New Orleans Saints, I think the big thing with them is that they just illustrate, we're always trying to change football and look at football in a different way. But at the end of the day, if you dominate in the trenches like they did yesterday, you can win any football game you go into. And I think there was a lot of concern there. David Onyemata, their stud inside defensive tackle, out with a suspension for 6 weeks. But Cam Jordan and Marcus Davenport, who is dealing with an injury now, really just dominated the Packers yesterday. They're missing David Bakhtiari, their star left tackle. Elton Jenkins graded very well for us, so he was fine in replacement. But the rest of that offensive line, specifically the interior, was really, really poor. Aaron Rodgers couldn't do anything. And then that secondary, too. I had a lot of question marks there. Bradley Roby, the guy they traded for with the Houston Texans, hasn't even arrived yet. But their rookie Paulson Adebo looked really good yesterday. The Saints are legit. Jameis 5 touchdowns. I was very wrong there, and they look like a legitimate team, and they can push the ball downfield at times to Winston. Drew Brees actually made a joke in the booth saying that's a new element to their offense is the deep passing game. So the Saints are, I guess, a team to watch.
For sure. And Juwan Johnson, their tight end, made 2 incredible catches in the red zone. So definitely a threat to watch there. Let's get into biggest surprises of the week. And I'm actually not overreacting about something that I'm sure some people are overreacting to. And that's the Bills' performance. Lost to the Steelers 23-16. I know that a lot of people had this pegged as a win for the Buffalo Bills. But honestly, I didn't see anything that was of great concern in that game. And the biggest thing that would be concerning would have been Josh Allen's performance. But I thought that Josh Allen actually played pretty similarly to how he did last season. I dug through the PFF stats, only 1 turnover-worthy play that was better than he was last season. 71.4 adjusted completion percentage, that was slightly down from last year. 10.4 average depth of target, that was up from last year. Air yards up, average time to throw was down. So all of his stats were pretty much on par with what they were last season. 66% accuracy percentage, that was up. Catchable inaccurate percentage was down, but uncatchable inaccurate percentage was up. The biggest thing there was that the Bills' offensive line really struggled against the Steelers' defense, which is understandable. Cameron Hayward, actually PFF's top-graded defensive player from week 1. I believe he had something like 12 pressures in that game. You're also dealing with Joe Hayden, TJ Watt, Marvin Ingram, all of whom ranked in the top 25 graded defensive players. Alex Highsmith and Cameron Sutton also were in the top 40, and that's before you even get to guys like Minkah Fitzpatrick. So I think that was the big takeaway, is that the Steelers' defense looking like they're definitely going to be legit again. Bills have some things to fix, especially on their offensive line. They didn't play quite as well. There were 3 drops from Bills wide receivers, Cole Beasley, Gabriel Davis, and Devin Singletary. So it was one of those games where everything that could have went wrong for the Bills kind of did. There was the block punt for the touchdown. So I still think that they are a Super Bowl contending team. I think they're still the front runners in the AFC East. This was just a game that didn't go their way, but that was still surprising for me that they were not able to come away from a home game against the Steelers with a win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It was definitely a surprise, but it shows again, Mike Tomlin, everyone, whenever they count him out, they somehow, come through. And, this is a head coach who's never had a losing season in his entire career as a head coach. So this is a team that always fights for him, and they showed that yesterday. For me, it's a team that won, but I was surprised to see them play so well. It's the Texans. And listen, I don't know how many people watch the Texans and Jaguars game, but I wanted to get a glimpse of how both these teams would do. And considering all the drama and considering all the new roster moves and considering the new coaching staff, that team played as if they've been together for the past 3-4 years. I mean, it was impressive to see. Tyrod Taylor looked really good. And I spoke to his quarterbacks coach, Quincy Avery, last week. He said that Tyrod is the least respected quarterback in the league. And now that Tyrod, this is his team now in Houston, he's going to show what he can do. And he really, really played well. He was slinging it around. Brandon Cooks hauled in some big catches. Danny Amendola was making an impact, even though he was just signed last week. The defense picked off Trevor Lawrence 3 times. I get it. We're not expecting much out of both these teams, but it was surprising to see the Texans dominate like that. And it was good to see David Culley get his first win, to see the players playing tough for him, especially after all that happened this offseason.
Yeah, for me, the biggest surprise, we touched on a little bit with Rondell Moore, but the Arizona Cardinals, particularly on defense, there was a million question marks about that secondary. You have Malcolm Butler retire about a week before the season. Robert Alford, who hasn't played in 2 full years now, has to come out and play on the outside, matching up with A.J. Brown and Julio Jones. Earned a 75.9 coverage grade for us, 76 overall grade, looked great. And that defensive front is going to take over games. First of all, Chandler Jones with 5 sacks. Coming into a contract year, was looking for an extension. I think his price just went up a little bit after that. But really across the board, the Cardinals looked really solid. They were scoring at will. Kyler Murray, I think, is taking that step. He had to dance around a little bit and create on his own. But I also think Cliff Kingsbury, that run game was really interesting. He had James Conner and Chase Edmonds working. They were running out of shotgun, a lot of motion, doing a lot of different things. And that Cardinals team, that NFC West is an absolute gauntlet. They all won. So every team in that division is 1-0, but the Cardinals are legit. And I think if that defensive front can do that well against the Titans, yes, the offensive line is not great. They lost some guys from last year. Derek Kelly at right tackle. Taylor Lewan is still recovering from a torn ACL, but they absolutely dominated that game. The Titans could do nothing. And also just a fun gambling point. The over in that game was 52. It was 38-13 after the third quarter, 51 points. And it went scoreless in the fourth quarter, including a missed 43-yard field goal. You can guess what side of that total I was on yesterday. So that was an exciting finish there as well.
Let's get into some of the news of the week. Ryan Fitzpatrick, one of the biggest injuries from Sunday, suffered a hip injury. I believe it was NFL Media who reported it was a hip subluxation, which essentially is a dislocated hip, which sounds incredibly painful. So timeline on his recovery still a little bit murky from what it seems. Certainly will not play this week since the Washington football team is playing on Thursday night. So it would be Taylor Heineke as the starter. And then they just signed Kyle Shermer to the practice squad. And they still have, what's his name as the backup? Kyle Allen as the backup there behind Taylor Heineke. So I would say that certainly looks like they're going to be rolling with Heineke at this point, especially on a short week like this. No point in bringing in anyone else to try to start. But I would say that his performance on Thursday and then also the timeline on the recovery for Ryan Fitzpatrick might determine whether they do want to bring in another quarterback, whether that's in free agency. Cam Newton's still out there. I know that there's some questions about whether Washington would sign him with his vaccination status and some other elements. But then there's also some trade candidates out there as well. Nick Foles still on the Chicago Bears, Marcus Mariota with the Las Vegas Raiders. If the Washington football team thinks that they are going to be competitive this year, which from week one, it certainly looked like they will be, and if Ryan Fitzpatrick is going to be out for a lengthy amount of time, then yeah, that is certainly a situation worth monitoring with what they're going to do at quarterback. But the first question that needs to be answered is how long Fitz is going to be out, because if it's a short-term situation, it probably makes sense to just roll with Heineke for the time being, and then just wait for Fitzpatrick to get healthy at that point.
Yeah, I mean, for sure that would be the way to go. We have to figure out exactly how long he'll be out first, as you said, Doug. But, this is a team that really liked what they saw out of Heineke last year, especially in that playoff game against Tampa Bay. They brought him back here in the offseason on a 2-year deal. So they do like Heineke, but I think everyone's question is going to be, are they actually going to roll with him the entire year if it gets to that point? Right. And the question everyone is going to ask is, of course, the name that was just released in Cam Newton, who, of course, played with Ron Rivera for so many years there in Carolina. But the thing is, last year Cam was a free agent and Ron Rivera was looking for a quarterback, and he decided to trade a pick to get Kyle Allen. So, you could ask the question, maybe he didn't want to have the same situation with Mac Jones. Dwayne Haskins was there, have a veteran lurking behind him. Could that be the scenario there? But that is the only other quarterback that actually has some familiarity there with Ron Rivera, which is worth mentioning. But again, we don't know how long Ryan Fitzpatrick will be out. But, going into training camp, there was so much excitement for Fitzpatrick. Looked at the receivers there with Terry McLaurin and Curtis Samuel, Logan Thomas. They spoke so highly about Ryan Fitzpatrick. Everyone talks about him being a great teammate. And now that he's going to be out, that's a really big bummer there for a team that many people thought could win this division.
100%. And they had an offseason that a lot of us really, thought was strong and made a lot of solid moves. And I think a lot of those moves look good yesterday as well. You mentioned Curtis Samuel, who did not play yesterday, and I guess maybe not going to play on Thursday with a short turnaround. But Move on from Morgan Moses at right tackle, which a lot of people questioned. He ends up not even starting for the Jets yesterday. George Fant gets to start at right tackle, and that may not be lasting too much longer. But Sam Cosmi looks great, the rookie at right tackle for Washington. William Jackson, I thought, played a good game against the Chargers. At the end there, they started to move the ball through the air, but for the most part, keeping that offense in check and keeping Justin Herbert in check. And then we know that defensive line, although the Chargers' offensive line looked great, we know they're going to take over some games here and there. Yeah. So I think it is a tough situation where, yes, they like Heinicke. He gave him a solid 2-year deal. But if you don't think he can carry this team to the playoffs and really win some games, you mentioned Marcus Mariota. He has a no-trade clause, so he'd have to sign off there. But seems like a pretty good situation to come into if you're him, potentially on a playoff roster in a weaker division. The Giants did not look good at all yesterday. The Eagles did look pretty good, but they might have to make a move there because it might be too good of a roster to waste.
Mm-hmm. Another big injury from the weekend, Jerry Jeudy suffered an ankle injury that's reportedly a high ankle sprain. So that's another one where kind of have to wait on the severity of that high ankle sprain to know whether or not he's going to come back. But the Broncos are another team that was impressive on Sunday. They beat the Giants 27-13. No, it wasn't the fiercest competition from New York, but Jerry Jeudy was expected to be their top wide receiver this year. They do still have some good depth there at wide receiver, which should help them. In the meantime, KJ Hamler, I know he had a big drop in that game against the Giants, but he's a player that the Broncos really like during training camp. Tim Patrick, who was one of the better fourth wide receivers in the NFL. Cortland Sutton didn't do a whole lot on Sunday, but he was the top wide receiver there with the Broncos before he suffered an injury last season. So that's a hit for the Broncos, though, because since it is a high ankle sprain, you would expect Jeudy to be out for a fairly significant amount of time, and being without that top wide receiver certainly will not help Teddy Bridgewater in a competitive AFC West.
No, you're right 100%. But, looking at the bright side, I mean, when we saw that injury, we all thought it was much worse. So for it to be a high ankle sprain is a little bit of a sigh of relief there. He will obviously miss time. He actually posted on Instagram this morning that I'll be back soon. So he will be missing some time. But again, it's not something that could have been much, much worse, which is a big deal for Denver. And again, Doug mentioned it. They are pretty stacked at wide receivers. So, they were expecting Jerry to really go off this year in his sophomore year. But regardless, that's a position group that should be able to hold up until he comes back.
Yeah, the video was a little scary, and I know we're saying it's great news, and it definitely is better news than a tear or anything like that. But it's important to remember that high ankle sprain is the injury that Michael Thomas, the Saints wide receiver, suffered, and he was not himself the entire season last year. Then goes into the offseason. There's kind of some back and forth there about when he should get a surgery, if he should get a surgery, and of course now he's going to miss at least half of this season as well. So while it could have been worse, it is a significant injury, and I think he might miss, half the season. It is a tough loss, but yeah, they are super deep at wide receiver. Tim Patrick had some great catches yesterday, so they will step up there, but it is definitely a big loss.
A couple other quick injuries to monitor. Jets left tackle Mekhi Becton, kneecap dislocation per Ian Rappaport of NFL Media. And then Browns head coach Kevin Stefanski just announced that Jedrick Wills has an ankle injury that's day-to-day. X-rays were negative. It seemed like there was certainly some promising news there with Jedrick Wills. But before we get into some questions real quick, Brad, just wanted to get your takeaway on Marshawn Lattimore's new contract. It was an eventful few days with Marshawn Lattimore, where suddenly it was questionable with a knee injury, wound up playing, hurt his wrist or his hand in that game. Yeah. Seems like he could be out for a couple of weeks, but also signed a big contract extension. So Brad, take us into a little bit more of the details on that contract.
Yeah, so certainly a very, busy couple days there for him. We knew they were working this all off season. He was on his 5th-year option deal. They actually prorated a bunch of his 5th-year option money just so they could fit under the cap. And I think part of the situation there was something of a favor to add void years there. And it was saying, hey, we're going to work towards an extension. We're going to get this done. Comes the 3rd highest paid cornerback in the NFL, $19.5 million per year. Really strong guarantees. Gets the most fully guaranteed at signing ever for a defensive back. Just over $44 million, tops Byron Jones, tops, Jalen Ramsey, all these guys. So really strong deal there. I think another interesting connection to that is he has the same agent as Denzel Ward, the Browns cornerback, 2018 first-round pick. There was rumors that deal was being worked on, and there was, some motion there. So maybe that happens mid-season. Maybe they wait till after the season now. But definitely a huge deal and continues these defensive backs, particularly corners, continues to grow that market. He looked phenomenal against Devontae Adams yesterday, so he made them look smart pretty much right away.
Let's get into some questions real quick. Matt Vincent, LWOS, thoughts on the Brandon Ayuk situation? I was at 49ers camp at one point this summer, and I actually didn't come away from that training camp practice overly impressed with the 49ers wide receivers. Deebo Samuel actually had a good game before his fumble on Sunday. Had some drops in that practice. Brandon Ayuk was struggling to make some plays. It was a joint practice with the Chargers, and the Chargers defensive backs were really dominating the 49ers wide receivers in that practice, which is not something that I was expecting. But also a takeaway from that practice was that Jimmy Garoppolo was actually asked a question about Trey Sermon. He thought the question was about Trent Sherfield, and he just started raving about Trent Sherfield, saying, "Oh, this guy's a stud, blah 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 blah." And the person who was asking the question was like, "Well, that's great, but I was actually asking about Trey Sermon." And the response about Trey Sermon wasn't quite as I guess vigorous as the one about Trent Sherfield. So I knew that the 49ers were pretty high on Trent Sherfield. Wasn't expecting myself for him to cut so much into Brandon Ayuk snaps, but certainly looks like Deebo Samuel going to be the top wide receiver there. Maybe Trent Sherfield and Brandon Ayuk will be sharing snaps, seeing who emerges out of that, and then Mohamed Sanu taking snaps out of the slot. But Ari, what's your read on that 49ers wide receiver situation right now?
Yeah, it for sure surprised me when it happened, seeing Brandon Ayuk not being on the field, especially after last year, knowing how much the 49ers coveted him when they drafted him, seeing him on the field last year. He had some highlight plays, especially that game against Philadelphia on Sunday night, right? So, to see him not being on the field was a bit surprising. But then again, what we've learned from Kyle Shanahan is that he's not scared to put in other players if he thinks they deserve to be on the field. And Trent Sherfield, as you said, Doug, was really the star of camp for San Francisco. He connected really well with Trey Lance as well. He caught a touchdown yesterday from Trey Lance, and he was the guy who was on the field yesterday, and he was still making plays. Now, what does that mean for Brandon Ayuk? I don't think he's going to be on the bench all year. But then again, you have to remember this. Dante Pettis was on this 49ers team, a second-round pick, and they just, put him on the bench and didn't play him at all. Eventually, he was waived, and now he's still a free agent right now after being released by the Giants. So, again, Kyle Shanahan has shown that he is willing to put guys on the bench regardless of where they picked him in the draft, and that happened on Sunday to Brandon Ayuk.
Yeah, I mean, it happened with Trey Sermon as well. Elijah Moore playing ahead of him, drafted later. Like you said, Kyle Shanahan is not afraid to do that. I'm glad we're talking a lot about Trent Sherfield. He went to the greatest college in the country, Vanderbilt University. But yeah, he looked phenomenal. And I think a guy who knows a little bit about wide receiver play, Larry Fitzgerald, played with Sherfield in Arizona. He was on their practice squad, and he can't stop raving about him as well. He had a bunch of comments on Twitter and I think on a radio hit just talking about how hard this kid works and how, his game has gotten better year in and year out. So, yeah, the 49ers, it's a good problem to have, but certainly interesting to see Ayuk, already, first-round pick last year, like you mentioned, already kind of moving down the depth chart is definitely interesting.
Let's close it out here with a question from Dre Gunner. Titans blown out at home. Are we feeling the loss of Arthur Smith? Brad, you talked a little bit about the Cardinals defense before, but yeah, that performance did come against the Titans. Cardinals won 38-13. Derrick Henry got off to a pretty slow start in that game, only wound up with 58 yards on 17 carries, but that's sometimes been par for the course without a big lead that Derrick Henry sometimes struggles to get going a little bit. And especially early in the season, Derrick Henry has really had some of his best performances late in the season. I'm not personally ready to hit the full panic button about this, but you take Arthur Smith out at offensive coordinator, and clearly you're probably going to see some sort of drop off in that unit. Ryan Tannehill didn't quite look like himself, but they did add some pieces around him with Julio Jones coming in this season. Brad, what's your panic level on the Titans offense at this point?
Yeah, I don't think you can hit the panic button just yet. I mean, particularly because the AFC South, the Colts didn't look good either. So there's still plenty of season left, and we think it's probably those two teams battling it out. So there's no reason to panic about their season. But I think it's fair to be concerned. Arthur Smith versus Todd Downing, their new offensive play caller, did not look good with the Denver Broncos the last time it was an offensive coordinator and play caller. They've become infamous for their play action and getting Tannehill in motion, getting Tannehill rolling right and left. They had very little of that yesterday. Granted, when you're down a bunch like we discussed, you can't do as much of that. teams aren't really going to be biting on play action when you're down, a ton of points, and Derrick Henry is not as effective. There was a stretch of the game where you could tell the Cardinals were basically just asking them to run with Derrick Henry, and he was getting 5-6 yards a clip, but they didn't care because they were burning clock and just kind of letting them slowly maneuver down the field. So I think it's fair to be a bit concerned. I mean, Arthur Smith was a very, very good play caller, and Todd Downing has a lot to prove still. They went away from their play action. Like I said, they went away from a lot of things they do and do well. And also the Cardinals secondary, like we said, was one of the biggest question marks or worries of the entire NFL coming into this game. You're going up against Robert Alford, who did not play for 2 seasons, who looked very good, and Marco Wilson, a rookie out of Florida, also looked good. So it's probably not going to get much easier in the secondary. Then again, though, the Cardinals' defensive front, like we mentioned, obviously was dominant yesterday. Both their first-round linebackers I thought looked good, in Isaiah Simmons and Zaven Collins, and obviously J.J. Watt, and go down the list. But I think it's fair to be concerned.
I think it's worth mentioning, first of all, that last month the Titans had a COVID situation and a lot of guys missed time, including the head coach, including the quarterback. Secondly, as you mentioned, there's a new offensive coordinator there. Thirdly, Julio Jones barely practiced at all during training camp, so the connection with Ryan Tannehill isn't there. I think it's going to take some time to get this all to come together. And again, there are 16 more games left. There's a lot more playing time here. There's really no reason to panic on a team that has really had so much success over the last couple of years. Everyone is really back there. If anything, they added more pieces, including Julio Jones. So yeah, I wouldn't panic yet. Of course, it's only week 1, but it's something that we're going to be watching here as the weeks go on to see how the chemistry flows over there.
Definitely. Yeah. Could be looking later in the season as one of those just strange week 1 performances that doesn't really relate to the rest of the season. But that will do it for this week's show. Thank you for watching. Follow Ari on Twitter at MySportsUpdate. Follow Brad on Twitter at PFF_Brad. Follow me on Twitter at Doug Kyed. And like I said earlier, use that promo code Kickoff30 for 30% off any subscription at PFF.com.